London in the early 1980s was a city of stark contrasts. The wealth of Mayfair and Kensington existing alongside the poverty of council estates and squats, the gleaming modernity of the financial district rising above neighborhoods still scarred by wartime bombing that had never been fully repaired. It was a city where thousands of young people lived on the margins, sleeping rough in doorways and hostels, surviving through odd jobs and government assistance and the occasional kindness of strangers. Among those strangers was a man named Dennis Nilsen, a 37-year-old civil servant who worked at a job center in Kentish Town, helping unemployed people find work and navigate the bureaucracy of benefits. He was known to his colleagues as quiet, competent, somewhat isolated but pleasant enough when approached. He lived alone in a flat at the top of a Victorian conversion house in Muswell Hill, a respectable North London neighborhood of tree-lined streets and solid middle-class homes. Dennis was the kind of person you wouldn't notice twice: medium height, thinning dark hair, glasses, dressed in the drab professional clothing of a government worker. He had no criminal record. He had served in the army and briefly in the Metropolitan Police. He was educated, articulate, capable of engaging conversation when the mood struck him. He seemed, in every observable way, ordinary. But between 1978 and 1983, Dennis Nilsen murdered at least 12 young men and boys in his 2 London flats, and likely killed 3 more whose bodies were never found. He would meet them in pubs in central London, vulnerable young men, often homeless or near homeless, often lonely and desperate for human connection. He would invite them back to his flat for food and drink and conversation. They would accept, grateful for the warmth and the kindness and the prospect of a meal. And in the night, while they slept or passed out drunk on his floor, Dennis would strangle them. He would watch them die with what he later described as a detached fascination. And then, in what makes his case one of the most psychologically disturbing in criminal history, he would keep their bodies for weeks or sometimes months, bathing them, dressing them, positioning them in chairs, talking to them, watching television with corpses seated beside him as if they were companions who could still provide the connection he craved. When the bodies became too decomposed to keep, he would dismember them. At his first flat on Melrose Avenue, he would burn the remains in bonfires in the back garden, the smoke and smell drifting over the neighboring properties while Dennis sat and watched the flames. At his second flat on Cranley Gardens, which had no garden, he would boil the flesh from the bones and flush it down the toilet, disposing of the skeletal remains in the trash or by carrying them to waste ground in the dead of night. He continued this pattern for 5 years, killing with a regularity that suggested compulsion rather than opportunity, until a blocked drain at Cranley Gardens led to the discovery of human remains in the plumbing, and the subsequent investigation revealed the full horror of what Dennis Nilsen had been doing in those respectable North London flats. This is the story of Dennis Nilsen, the Muswell Hill Murderer, one of Britain's most prolific serial killers. This is the story of at least 15 young men and boys whose lives were stolen by a man who craved companionship so desperately that he preferred the company of corpses to the loneliness of an empty flat. This is the story of how an apparently ordinary civil servant became a killer whose crimes shocked a nation. These are the fatal headlines. Part 1. The Making of a Killer. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, a fishing town on the northeast coast of Scotland, a place of harsh winters and harder economic realities, where the sea provided both livelihood and danger to the men who worked it. His birth came in the closing months of World War II, in a household already marked by absence and dysfunction. His mother, Betty White, had married a Norwegian soldier named Olav Nilsen during the war. The marriage was troubled from the beginning. Olav was an alcoholic who showed little interest in domestic life, and Betty was a young woman struggling to raise children in difficult circumstances. Dennis was the second of 3 children born to the couple, though Olav would father additional children with Betty before the marriage finally collapsed. Olaf Nilsen was largely absent even when physically present, drinking heavily and showing no affection toward his children. Dennis would later describe his father as a complete stranger, someone who occupied the house but had no meaningful relationship with anyone in it. When Betty finally left Olav and the marriage dissolved, Dennis was barely a year old, and he retained no memories of his father at all. After the separation, Betty and her children moved into the home of her parents, Andrew and Lily White. Dennis's grandfather, Andrew, became the most important figure in his early childhood, a stern but loving man who worked as a fisherman, and who showed Dennis the only real affection and attention he received in those years. Andrew White took his grandson with him on walks, taught him about the sea and the boats, gave him a sense of being valued and important. When Dennis was 6 years old, Andrew White died of a heart attack while out at sea. His body was brought home, and in what would prove to be a psychologically devastating decision, the family allowed young Dennis to view his grandfather's corpse in an open coffin. Dennis later described this experience as the most traumatic of his childhood, seeing the man he loved transformed into a waxy, lifeless thing, beautiful in its stillness, peaceful in a way that disturbed him profoundly. Something shifted in Dennis's mind in the presence of his dead grandfather. He felt both grief and something else, something he couldn't name but that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A fascination with the aesthetics of death, with the transformation from living flesh to corpse, with the stillness and silence and strange beauty of the dead body. He would later identify this moment as the origin of his necrophilic compulsions, though whether this is accurate self-analysis or a retrospective construction is impossible to determine. After Andrew White's death, Dennis's childhood became progressively more isolated and unhappy. His mother remarried to a man named Adam Scott and had 4 more children with him. Dennis felt displaced in the crowded household, neither fully part of his mother's new family nor important enough to receive individual attention. He withdrew into himself, spending time alone, developing an interior life that he shared with no one. He was an intelligent child, capable academically, but he struggled socially. He had few friends. He was bullied at school for being small and bookish, targeted by rougher boys who sensed his vulnerability. He learned to avoid confrontation, to make himself invisible, to retreat into solitude rather than risk the pain of rejection or violence. He also began to realize, as he entered adolescence, that he was attracted to other boys. In 1950s and 1960s Scotland, homosexuality was not just stigmatized. It was criminal, punishable by imprisonment. Dennis understood instinctively that his feelings were something that had to be hidden, that any expression of them would result in catastrophic social and legal consequences. He buried them deep, sublimating them into fantasy, developing an interior world of sexual and romantic longing that could never be expressed in reality. At age 15, Dennis joined the Army, enlisting in the Army Catering Corps in 1961. The military offered structure, purpose, escape from the claustrophobic dysfunction of his home. He served competently for 11 years, rising to the rank of corporal, stationed in various locations including a tour in Aden, now Yemen, during the British withdrawal from that colony. The Army also provided Dennis with his first sexual experiences. He had brief encounters with other soldiers, furtive and shameful, conducted in the knowledge that discovery would mean court-martial and imprisonment. He learned to compartmentalize, to maintain the appearance of normalcy while pursuing the relationships he craved in secret. But the Army also reinforced his isolation. He had no close friends. He formed no lasting relationships. He was known to his fellow soldiers as competent but distant, someone who did his job but never quite connected with the camaraderie that military service often generates. In 1972, Dennis left the Army and briefly joined the Metropolitan Police, working as a probationary constable. This career lasted less than a year. Dennis later said he left because he found the work boring and the culture of the police alienating. But there are suggestions that he was asked to leave after exhibiting behavior that concerned his superiors. The exact nature of that behavior has never been fully disclosed, but it may have involved inappropriate attention to crime scene photographs or other signs of the fascination with death that would later manifest so devastatingly. After leaving the police, Dennis drifted for a while, working various jobs before settling into a position as an executive officer at the job center in Kentish Town, helping unemployed people navigate the benefits system and find work. It was stable civil service employment, undemanding and respectable, the kind of job that allowed him to maintain a middle-class existence in London while leaving his evenings and weekends free. In 1975, Dennis moved into a garden flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, a North London neighborhood. The flat had its own entrance and a small private garden, details that would prove significant later. It was here, in this unremarkable flat on an unremarkable street, that Dennis Nilsen would begin his killing. But the killing did not begin immediately. For the first few years at Melrose Avenue, Dennis lived a lonely but not yet murderous existence. He had a relationship with a younger man named David Gallatin that lasted approximately 2 years, the closest thing to a conventional domestic partnership that Dennis would ever experience. But Gallatin eventually left, unable to tolerate Dennis's increasing moodiness and his disturbing fascination with death imagery and photographs. After Gallatin's departure in 1977, Dennis's loneliness intensified. He drank heavily, sitting alone in his flat night after night, listening to music, sometimes going to pubs in central London to seek human contact, but rarely finding any that satisfied him. He later described feeling like a ghost, present in the world but not part of it, observing life but unable to participate meaningfully. And then, on December 30, 1978, he killed for the first time. Part 2. The Melrose Avenue Murders. The first victim was a 14-year-old Irish boy named Stephen Holmes. Stephen had come to London like so many young people in the 1970s, seeking adventure, escaping difficult family circumstances, looking for opportunity or at least a more interesting life than the one offered by his small hometown. He was sleeping rough, surviving on the streets, vulnerable in ways that made him nearly invisible to the broader society. Dennis met Stephen in a pub in central London on December 29, 1978. They talked, and Dennis offered the boy a place to stay for the night, a kind gesture, or so it seemed. Stephen accepted. They went back to Melrose Avenue, drank beer, listened to music. Stephen fell asleep on the floor. And Dennis, looking at the sleeping boy, was overwhelmed by a feeling he would later struggle to articulate. It was not primarily sexual, though there were sexual elements. It was something more complex, a desperate need to prevent the boy from leaving, to keep him there permanently, to ensure that Dennis would not be alone again when morning came. Dennis strangled Stephen with a tie while he slept. He later described the killing as almost accidental, as if his hands acted without his conscious intention. But the killing was followed by something that was clearly deliberate. Dennis undressed the body, carried it to the bathroom, and bathed it carefully, washing the corpse as if caring for a living person. He then took the body to bed with him, holding it close, trying to simulate the intimacy and companionship he had craved. In the morning, he hid the body under the floorboards of his flat, covering it with debris, telling himself he would dispose of it properly later. But he didn't dispose of it. Instead, over the following weeks, he would periodically take the body out from under the floorboards, position it in a chair in his living room, and sit with it, talking to it, watching television with the corpse beside him. He later said that the body provided companionship, that it was better than being alone, that the presence of the dead boy made the flat feel less empty. Eventually, months later, when the decomposition became too advanced to continue this ritual, Dennis dismembered the body and burned the remains in a bonfire in his back garden. He would repeat this process with increasing frequency over the next 3 years. His second victim was Kenneth Ockenden, a 23-year-old Canadian tourist visiting London. Kenneth had been staying with relatives but had arranged to meet Dennis for a casual social evening after they met in a pub. Kenneth's family expected him to return that evening. He never did. Dennis strangled him, kept his body for 2 weeks, and then dismembered and burned it. The victims came with increasing frequency throughout 1979 and 1980. Martin Duffy, 16 years old, a catering student from Birkenhead who had come to London seeking work. Dennis met him at a bus stop, offered him a place to stay, strangled him. Billy Sutherland, 26, from Edinburgh, homeless and vulnerable. Dennis met him in a pub, took him home, killed him. The pattern was consistent. Dennis would frequent pubs in central London, particularly around the areas where homeless and vulnerable young men gathered. He would identify someone who was alone, who seemed isolated, who looked like they could use a meal and a place to sleep. He would strike up a conversation, offer hospitality, take them back to Melrose Avenue. Sometimes they would have sex before the killing. Sometimes Dennis would make a sexual advance that was rejected, and he later claimed that some of his victims died because they rejected him, though this explanation is questionable given that he killed men who accepted his advances as well. The sexual component was present but variable. What was constant was the killing itself, the strangulation, and the retention of the body afterward. Between late 1978 and early 1981, Dennis killed at least 8 young men and boys at Melrose Avenue. Some have been identified: Stephen Holmes, Kenneth Ockenden, Martin Duffy, Billy Sutherland, and others. Some remain unidentified to this day, young men whose disappearances were never reported because they had no stable families, no fixed addresses, no one who was tracking their movements. Dennis's method of disposal evolved. He dismembered the bodies in his bathtub, a process he described with disturbing clinical detachment in his later confessions. He would boil the heads to remove flesh from bone, a procedure that generated an awful smell that neighbors occasionally noticed but attributed to cooking or drains. He burned what he could in bonfires, reducing bones to ash and fragments. He also began keeping trophies. He would keep the skulls of some victims after processing them, storing them in his wardrobe or using them as ashtrays. He kept photographs of the bodies in various poses. He kept personal items that had belonged to the victims: watches, wallets, items that had no monetary value but represented the person who had owned them. The psychological complexity of Dennis's behavior during this period is extraordinary and disturbing. He was not killing in rage or sexual frenzy, though both elements were present. He was killing primarily to prevent loneliness, to create permanent companions who could never leave him. The necrophilic component, the bathing, dressing, and positioning of corpses, the keeping them for weeks or months, was central to his pathology in ways that distinguished him from most serial killers. He later said that he preferred the dead to the living, that corpses were better company than people who could reject or leave him. This was not entirely accurate. He clearly preferred living companions when he could form genuine relationships, as his time with David Gallatin demonstrated. But when living companionship was unavailable or ended, the dead became substitutes that satisfied his need for presence in the flat. By late 1981, Dennis's landlord was planning to sell the property, and Dennis would need to move. This created a logistical problem. The flats available for rent in his price range were in larger buildings without private gardens, which meant he would lose the ability to burn bodies in bonfires. But rather than seeing this as an opportunity to stop killing, Dennis simply modified his disposal method. In October 1981, Dennis moved to 23 Cranley Gardens, Muswell Hill, a top-floor flat in a Victorian conversion house. He would continue killing there, disposing of bodies through different means that would ultimately lead to his discovery and arrest. Part 3. CRNLYGRDNS and the End. The flat at 23 Cranley Gardens was smaller than Melrose Avenue and lacked a private garden, which meant Dennis would need to find alternative methods of disposing of bodies. The building housed several flats and had shared plumbing, a detail that would prove crucial to Dennis's eventual capture. The first murder at Cranley Gardens occurred in November 1981, just weeks after Dennis moved in. The victim was John Howlett, known as John the Guardsman, a 23-year-old man Dennis met in a pub. He strangled John and then faced the problem of what to do with the body without access to a garden for burning. Dennis's solution was macabre and practical. He would dissect the body in his bathtub, boil the flesh from the bones to make them easier to dispose of, and flush the organic material down the toilet. The bones and other solid remains he would carry out in bags and dispose of in waste ground or bins around the neighborhood. This process generated enormous amounts of organic material going into the building's shared plumbing system, far more than the pipes were designed to handle. It also generated a smell that the other residents began to notice, a disgusting, rotting odor that seemed to come from the drains. Dennis killed again in 1982. Malcolm Barlow, 24 years old, was the second victim at Cranley Gardens. Dennis had actually called an ambulance for Malcolm earlier in the day when he found him unwell on the street, a gesture of genuine concern that makes Dennis's subsequent actions all the more disturbing. After Malcolm was released from the hospital, he returned to Dennis's flat to thank him. Dennis strangled him that night. The final victim was Stephen Sinclair, 20 years old, killed in January 1983. Stephen was a homeless drug addict whom Dennis met near Leicester Square. He brought Stephen home, and when Stephen fell asleep or passed out, Dennis strangled him with a tie. It was the disposal of Stephen Sinclair's body that would lead to Dennis's discovery. On February 8, 1983, several residents of 23 Cranley Gardens complained to their landlord about blocked drains and a terrible smell. The landlord called in a drain cleaning company to investigate. The drain inspector, Michael Catron, removed a manhole cover outside the building and found a thick, white, fleshy substance blocking the pipe. He identified it as organic material but couldn't determine its source. Catron told the residents he would return the next morning to investigate further. That night, Dennis climbed down into the drain access and attempted to clear the blockage, removing some of the material and disposing of it elsewhere. But when Catron returned in the morning, he immediately recognized that someone had tampered with the drain. He retrieved some of the remaining material and consulted with his supervisor. They contacted the police. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. arrived at Cranley Gardens on February 9, 1983, and examined the material from the drains. It was identified as human flesh and small bones. Jay obtained a warrant to search the building and began interviewing the residents. When he knocked on Dennis Nilsen's door, Dennis answered calmly. Jay explained that they had found human remains in the drains and asked if Dennis knew anything about it. Dennis, later describing the moment, said he felt a sense of relief that it was finally over, that the charade of normal life could end. Jay asked directly, "Where's the rest of the body?" Dennis replied, "In 2 plastic bags in the wardrobe next door. I'll show you." He led the officers to his flat and showed them the bags containing the dismembered remains of Stephen Sinclair. Jay arrested Dennis on the spot. Dennis was taken to Hornsey Police Station for questioning. Over the next several days, he provided a full confession, describing in extraordinary detail the murders he had committed at both Melrose Avenue and Cranley Gardens. He confessed to killing 15 young men and boys over 5 years. He described his methods, his motivations, his disposal techniques, his feelings about the victims and about the crimes. His confession was remarkable for its calm, detailed nature. He spoke about the murders as if describing a project he had completed, noting practical problems and solutions, expressing some regret but little genuine remorse. He was cooperative with investigators, providing names when he knew them, descriptions when he didn't, helping police attempt to identify the victims whose remains had been destroyed. Police searched both of Dennis's former addresses. At Cranley Gardens, they found the remaining body parts of Stephen Sinclair and Malcolm Barlow. At Melrose Avenue, they excavated the garden and found bone fragments and ash from the bonfires where Dennis had burned his earlier victims. The forensic examination confirmed Dennis's confessions and provided physical evidence for at least some of the murders. Dennis was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The attempted murder charges related to 2 men who had survived encounters with Dennis, Paul Nobbs and Carl Stoddard, who had both been strangled but had either escaped or been released by Dennis before they died. The investigation attempted to identify all of Dennis's victims, but the destruction of the bodies at Melrose Avenue made this impossible in many cases. Of the 15 victims Dennis claimed, only 8 were ever definitively identified. The others remain nameless, young men who disappeared into Dennis Nilsen's flat and were never seen again. Part 4: The Trial. Dennis Nilsen's trial began on October 24, 1983, at the Old Bailey in London, before Justice Croom Johnson. Dennis was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He pleaded not guilty by reason of diminished responsibility, a defense under British law that acknowledges the defendant committed the acts, but argues that mental abnormality substantially impaired their responsibility. The prosecution was led by Alan Green QC, who presented Dennis as a calculating killer who murdered to satisfy his own needs, and then disposed of the evidence in a methodical, organized way that demonstrated clear understanding of what he was doing. The evidence was overwhelming. Dennis's own detailed confessions, the physical evidence recovered from his flats, the testimony of the 2 men who had survived his attacks. The defense, led by Ivan Lawrence QC, did not contest that Dennis had killed the men. Instead, they argued that he was suffering from severe personality disorders that impaired his ability to control his behavior, and that he should be found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. They brought psychiatric experts who testified about Dennis's psychological state. The psychiatric testimony presented Dennis as someone suffering from a complex of disorders including borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and what they termed necrophilic personality disorder. The experts described his profound isolation, his inability to form normal human relationships, his use of corpses as substitute companions, his dissociative states during the killings where he sometimes claimed not to fully remember his actions. Dennis himself testified, taking the stand to describe his crimes in the same calm, detailed manner he had used in his confessions. He wore his glasses and spoke clearly, explaining his actions without apparent shame or dramatic emotion. He described the loneliness, the drinking, the impulse to kill that he claimed came over him when he looked at the sleeping men, the subsequent keeping of the bodies because they provided companionship. The prosecution's psychiatric expert, Dr. Patrick Galway, testified that while Dennis certainly had personality disorders, he was not so impaired that he couldn't control his behavior. Galway argued that Dennis's meticulous disposal of bodies, his ability to hold down a job throughout the killing period, and his capacity to present a normal front to colleagues and neighbors all demonstrated that he knew what he was doing was wrong and was capable of choosing not to do it. The jury was presented with 2 competing narratives. The defense argued that Dennis was a deeply damaged man driven by compulsions he could not control, someone whose crimes were the product of mental abnormality rather than evil intent. The prosecution argued that Dennis was responsible for his actions regardless of his psychological issues, that he had chosen to kill, and had done so repeatedly over 5 years while maintaining the appearance of normal life. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for approximately 25 hours over several days before returning their verdict on November 4, 1983, guilty on all 6 murder counts and both attempted murder counts. They rejected the diminished responsibility defense and found Dennis fully responsible for his crimes. Justice Croom Johnson sentenced Dennis to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years before being considered for parole. In practice, given the severity and number of the crimes, it was understood that Dennis would likely never be released. Dennis showed no visible reaction to the verdict or the sentence. He was led from the dock calmly, already beginning what would be 34 years in prison. Part 5: Prison and Death. Dennis Nilsen was initially sent to Wormhood Scrubs, a Victorian-era prison in West London, before being transferred to HMP Full Sutton in Yorkshire, a maximum security facility where he would spend the majority of his incarceration. He was one of Britain's most notorious prisoners, someone whose crimes had shocked the nation and who would never be forgotten. His behavior in prison was generally good. He was polite to staff, caused few disciplinary problems, and settled into the routine of prison life with apparent ease. He worked in prison jobs, read extensively, and wrote prolifically. Letters, journals, attempts at autobiography that he hoped would someday be published. Dennis also developed a relationship with the writer Brian Masters, who was researching a book about the case. Masters corresponded with Dennis extensively, visited him in prison numerous times, and eventually published Killing for Company in 1985, a deeply researched and psychologically nuanced account of Dennis's crimes that became the definitive book on the case. The book presented Dennis as a complex figure, a killer, certainly, but also a deeply lonely and damaged person whose crimes emerged from profound psychological disturbance rather than simple evil. The book was controversial. Some felt that Masters had been too sympathetic to Dennis, too willing to accept his self-analysis, too focused on his interior psychological state, and not enough on the horror of what he had done to his victims. Others praised the book for its psychological insight and its refusal to reduce Dennis to a simple monster. Dennis himself seemed to enjoy the attention the book brought. He saw himself as a figure of historical and psychological importance, someone whose case provided insight into the darker corners of human psychology. He was not wrong that his case was psychologically significant. Necrophilic serial killers are relatively rare, and the extremity of his behavior made him a subject of genuine clinical interest. But his self-perception as a tragic figure, rather than a criminal, was harder to accept. Throughout his years in prison, Dennis continued to analyze his own crimes, writing extensive reflections on his motivations and psychological state. He attempted to explain himself in ways that were sometimes insightful and sometimes self-serving. He acknowledged the deaths of his victims but seemed unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what he had done, the suffering he had caused to the victims themselves and to their families. He also became involved in various legal battles over whether he should be allowed to publish his writings. The British government eventually passed the Son of Sam law prohibiting criminals from profiting from their crimes through media deals, a law that was partly inspired by Dennis's attempts to monetize his story. In 1994, Dennis was transferred to HMP Whitemoor in Cambridgeshire. In 2003, he was attacked by another inmate, suffering serious injuries including partial scalding from boiling water thrown at him. The attack was motivated partly by the nature of his crimes and partly by general prison politics. He recovered, but was left with permanent scarring. Dennis never expressed interest in seeking parole, understanding that it would never be granted and perhaps preferring the certainty of prison to the uncertainty of what rejection would feel like. He settled into being a lifer, someone who would die in prison, and seemed to accept this fate. On May 12, 2018, Dennis Nilsen was found unconscious in his cell at HMP Full Sutton. He had suffered a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. He was taken to York Hospital where he underwent emergency surgery, but he died on May 12, 2018, at age 72. His death received significant media coverage in Britain. The responses ranged from relief that he was finally gone to renewed discussion of his crimes and their impact. Some of the families of victims expressed satisfaction that he had died, that he would no longer be able to seek attention or claim to be anything other than what he was, a killer. Dennis was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea in accordance with his wishes, the same disposal he had given to some of his victims, a final irony that did not escape notice. Part 6. The Victims Remembered. The 15 young men and boys whom Dennis Nilsen killed deserve to be remembered as individuals with names, histories, and value, independent of the man who ended their lives. The tragedy is that many of them remain unidentified, their names unknown, their families never learning what happened to them. Stephen Holmes was 14 years old, an Irish boy who had come to London seeking adventure or escape from whatever troubled circumstances had driven him from home. He was Dennis's first victim, killed on December 30, 1978. His family reported him missing, but for years they had no answers about what had happened to him. His remains were identified through forensic examination of the ash and bone fragments from Melrose Avenue. Kenneth Ockenden was 23, a Canadian student who was visiting London on holiday, staying with an uncle. He had his whole life ahead of him: education, career, relationships, family. He met Dennis in a pub, accepted an invitation for a casual evening, and never returned to his uncle's house. His family searched for him desperately, never imagining that he had been murdered and his body burned in a garden bonfire in Cricklewood. Martin Duffy was 16, a catering student from Birkenhead who had come to London to find work. He called his mother on the day he met Dennis, telling her he had found a place to stay. It was the last time she heard his voice. Martin's family spent years not knowing what had happened to him until Dennis's confession provided the terrible answer. Billy Sutherland was 26, from Edinburgh, homeless and struggling but still a person with dignity and worth. He met Dennis in a pub, accepted an offer of hospitality, and was strangled for his trust. Malcolm Barlow was 24 when he died. Dennis had actually helped him earlier in the day, calling an ambulance when Malcolm was unwell. This makes Dennis's subsequent killing of him particularly disturbing, a gesture of genuine kindness followed by murder, suggesting the profound disconnection between Dennis's capacity for ordinary human compassion and his compulsion to kill. John Howlett, known as John the Guardsman, was 23. Stephen Sinclair was 20. Both were killed at Cranley Gardens, their bodies dismembered in Dennis's bathtub, their remains flushed down the shared plumbing of the building. The other victims, at least 7 of them and possibly more, remain unidentified. They were young men who disappeared into London's homeless population, whose absences were not noticed or reported, who had no one looking for them. Dennis killed them, burned them, scattered their ashes, and they vanished from the world, leaving no trace. This anonymity is itself a kind of crime, a failure of society to care for its most vulnerable members. These unidentified victims were someone's sons. Some may have had families who didn't know where they were, who spent years wondering what had happened, who never connected their missing loved one to the headlines about Dennis Nilsen. Some may have had no one at all, entirely alone in the world, which is perhaps even more tragic. Dennis targeted vulnerability with precision. He looked for young men who were homeless or near homeless, who were drinking alone in pubs, who seemed isolated and grateful for attention. He offered them what they needed most: warmth, food, human connection, and then he killed them for accepting his offer. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 26. They were at stages of life when futures are built, when possibilities are still opening rather than closing. They were robbed of all the years they should have had, all the experiences they should have been able to accumulate, all the people they might have become. Their families, those who had families who knew they were missing, spent years in a particular kind of hell, not knowing if their loved ones were dead or alive, hopping against hope that they might return someday while fearing the worst. The confirmation that Dennis had killed them was devastating, but also, for some, a kind of relief. At least the uncertainty was over, at least they knew. The two men who survived Dennis's attacks, Paul Nobbs and Carl Stoddard, carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They had come within moments of being among the dead, had been strangled to the point of unconsciousness, had woken to find themselves alive only because Dennis had for some reason decided to let them go. The randomness of survival, the knowledge that they had been that close to death, was a burden they would carry always. Part 7. Psychological Analysis. Dennis Nilsen's case presents one of the most psychologically complex profiles in the history of serial murder. He does not fit neatly into the categories that criminology has developed, and his motivations were different from most serial killers in ways that make him both fascinating and deeply disturbing to analyze. The most distinctive feature of Dennis's pathology was his necrophilia, not merely sexual attraction to corpses, though that was present, but something more complex that psychiatrists have struggled to categorize. He kept corpses for companionship as much as for sexual gratification. He bathed them, dressed them, positioned them in chairs, talked to them, treated them as if they were guests or roommates rather than dead bodies. This behavior suggests a profound disconnection from reality in some respects, but Dennis was not psychotic in the clinical sense. He knew the men were dead. He knew they couldn't respond to him, but he engaged in the fiction anyway because the presence of a body made the flat feel less empty, and an inanimate corpse was better company than no one at all. The roots of this pathology likely lie in his childhood experience of viewing his grandfather's corpse. Dennis himself identified this as a formative moment, and many psychiatrists who have studied his case agree that the association between death and love, between corpses and the loss of the most important person in his life, created a psychological template that shaped all his subsequent relationships with death. But this explanation, while important, is insufficient by itself. Many people experience traumatic encounters with death in childhood without developing necrophilic compulsions. What else about Dennis's psychology contributed to his becoming what he became? The profound isolation of his childhood and adolescence was clearly significant. Dennis had virtually no close relationships growing up. His mother was emotionally distant. His stepfather was uninvolved. He had no friends to speak of. The one meaningful relationship of his early life with his grandfather ended in death before Dennis was 7 years old. This isolation was compounded by his realization in adolescence that he was gay at a time and place where homosexuality was both illegal and deeply stigmatized. He could not express his sexuality openly, could not form romantic relationships without fear of criminal prosecution, could not imagine a future that included the kind of partnership and family life that heterosexual people could take for granted. This combination, profound loneliness, inability to form genuine connections, suppressed sexuality, childhood association between death and love, created a psychological structure that was fertile ground for the development of extreme pathology. The necrophilic compulsion itself seems to have developed as a solution to Dennis's fundamental problem. He desperately wanted companionship, but was unable to form or maintain relationships with living people. Living people could reject him, could leave him, could remind him of his inadequacy and loneliness. Dead people couldn't do any of those things. They were permanent, passive, completely under his control. The murders in this framework were instrumental rather than primarily gratifying in themselves. Dennis killed not because killing was what he wanted, but because killing was the means of obtaining corpses that would stay with him. The strangling was quick, relatively non-violent compared to many serial killers. He used ligatures or manual strangulation, waited until the victims were unconscious or asleep, ended it quickly. The brutality came after death, in the dismemberment and disposal, not in the killing itself. This distinguishes Dennis from sadistic serial killers who derive pleasure from the suffering of their victims. Dennis showed little interest in causing pain. He wanted the end result, the corpse, not the process of creating it. Dennis's intelligence and his capacity for self-reflection make him unusual among serial killers. Most serial killers either cannot or will not analyze their own behavior in any sophisticated way. Dennis spent decades thinking about his crimes, writing about them, attempting to understand his own psychology. His analysis was not always accurate and was certainly self-serving in places, but it showed a capacity for introspection that is rare in this population. He understood that he was profoundly abnormal. He understood that most people did not experience loneliness as he experienced it, did not need the presence of corpses to feel less alone, did not form emotional attachments to dead bodies. He recognized his own pathology even as he was compelled to act on it. This self-awareness did not prevent him from killing, which raises questions about the role of insight in controlling dangerous behavior. Dennis knew what he was doing was wrong legally, morally, by any normal standard. He did it anyway because the compulsion was stronger than his capacity to resist it, or because the alternative, continued unbearable loneliness, was worse than the guilt of killing. Whether Dennis could have been helped by psychiatric intervention is uncertain. He never sought help voluntarily, never told anyone about his compulsions before he began acting on them. By the time he killed Stephen Holmes in 1978, the pathology was probably too advanced for any treatment available in that era to address effectively. Modern psychiatric treatment for paraphilias and compulsive disorders is somewhat more advanced, but even today, the prognosis for someone with Dennis's level of disturbance would be poor. Part 8. The Investigation's Legacy. The investigation into Dennis Nilsen's crimes was, by the standards of British policing in the early 1980s, exemplary in many respects. The discovery of human remains in the drains led quickly to Dennis's identification and arrest. His willingness to confess meant that the investigation did not require the kind of extended detective work that many serial killer cases demand. Within days of the discovery, police had a full confession and substantial physical evidence. But the case also revealed systemic failures in how British society tracked and responded to missing persons, particularly those from marginalized populations. Many of Dennis's victims were homeless or near-homeless young men whose disappearances were never reported or were reported but not actively investigated. The fact that he could kill 15 people over 5 years without detection was partly due to his caution and partly due to the invisibility of his victims. The case prompted changes in how British police handled missing persons cases involving vulnerable populations. The recognition that homeless young people were at particular risk from predators like Dennis led to improved coordination between police, social services, and homelessness charities, though implementation of these improvements was uneven across different jurisdictions. The case also influenced the development of forensic techniques for identifying human remains in cases of extreme decomposition or destruction. The forensic examination of the ash and bone fragments from Melrose Avenue required techniques that were at the cutting edge of the field at the time, and the experience gained from the Nilsen investigation contributed to the refinement of those techniques. Dennis's calm, detailed confession became a subject of study for police interviewers and forensic psychologists. His willingness to cooperate, his detailed recall of events, and his capacity to discuss his crimes in clinical terms provided insight into how certain types of serial killers think about and remember their crimes. This influenced training for investigators who work serial killer cases, helping them understand what kinds of questions to ask and how to elicit useful information from suspects who might be willing to talk. The case also became important in the development of criminal profiling in Britain. While profiling had been used in some earlier cases, the Nilsen investigation was one of the first where detailed psychological analysis of the offender's behavior contributed significantly to understanding the crimes and the criminal. The profile that might have been developed had Dennis not been caught through the drain discovery would likely have been quite accurate in identifying him as an isolated homosexual male with profound intimacy deficits and necrophilic tendencies. In terms of legal legacy, the trial established or reinforced several principles of British criminal law regarding diminished responsibility defenses in murder cases. The jury's rejection of Dennis's diminished responsibility claim, despite clear evidence of significant psychological abnormality, affirmed that mental illness or personality disorder alone is not sufficient to reduce murder to manslaughter. The defendant must show that the abnormality substantially impaired their capacity to control their behavior, and the jury found that Dennis retained enough control to be fully responsible. The case also contributed to public and political pressure for longer sentences for serial killers. The recommendation that Dennis serve 25 years minimum was substantial for the time and reflected growing recognition that serial killers pose unique dangers that justify incapacitation regardless of prospects for rehabilitation. Part 9. Cultural Impact. Dennis Nilsen's case had significant cultural impact in Britain, where it became one of the defining criminal cases of the 1980s and remained in public consciousness for decades. The combination of the horror of the crimes, the number of victims, and the psychological complexity of the perpetrator made it endlessly fascinating to the media and to the public. Brian Masters's book, Killing for Company, was the most significant cultural artifact to emerge from the case. Published in 1985, it was both a commercial success and a critical one, praised for its psychological depth and its refusal to sensationalize while still conveying the full horror of what Dennis had done. The book treated Dennis as a complex human being whose crimes required understanding rather than simple condemnation, an approach that was controversial but that influenced how subsequent true crime writers approached their subjects. The case has been the subject of numerous television documentaries, most of which have taken a more conventional approach than Masters's book, focusing on the crimes themselves and the investigation rather than on Dennis's psychological interior. These documentaries have introduced the case to new generations and have kept it in public awareness. In 2020, Netflix released a miniseries called Des, using Dennis's nickname, starring David Tennant as Dennis Nilsen. The series was based partly on Masters's book and partly on other source material, and it focused on the investigation, confession, and trial. Tennant's performance captured Dennis's calm, analytical manner and his profound emotional disconnection, presenting him as neither monster nor victim, but as something more complex and harder to categorize. The series was both praised and criticized. Some felt it humanized Dennis too much, that it made him a sympathetic figure when he deserved no sympathy. Others argued that understanding is not sympathy, that seeing Dennis as a human being whose pathology developed through specific circumstances is important for preventing similar cases in the future. The case also became significant in discussions of gay identity and representation in crime and media. Dennis was gay, and his sexuality was clearly related to his crimes. He targeted young men. His killings had sexual components. His inability to form normal gay relationships in a homophobic society contributed to his isolation. but using Dennis as an example of gay criminality was obviously problematic and offensive to LGBT communities, who were already fighting against stereotypes that associated homosexuality with deviance and danger. Some gay activists argued that media coverage of Dennis's case contributed to homophobia by reinforcing the idea that gay men were predatory and dangerous. Others argued that denying the role of sexuality in understanding his crimes was dishonest, and that examining the ways homophobia and social stigma contributed to his isolation was important rather than homophobic. This tension has never been fully resolved, and Dennis's case remains a fraught example in discussions of how sexuality intersects with violence and how media should handle crimes that have sexual dimensions. The case also became part of broader cultural conversations about loneliness and social isolation in modern urban life. Dennis's core problem was loneliness, a loneliness so profound that he preferred corpses to an empty flat. This is an extreme manifestation of something that many people experience in less extreme forms: the isolation of urban life, where millions of people live in close proximity, but many feel entirely alone. Dennis himself, in his prison writings, sometimes positioned himself as an extreme example of a universal human problem, arguing that his need for companionship was fundamentally normal and that only his method of obtaining it was aberrant. This self-analysis was self-serving and deeply flawed, but it touched on something real: the epidemic of loneliness in modern societies and the damage it does to people who cannot find connection. Part 10. Comparisons and contrasts. Dennis Nilsen's case invites comparison to other serial killers in this series and in the broader history of serial murder, but the comparisons reveal as much about how he was different as about what he shared with other killers. Like Jeffrey Dahmer, Dennis killed primarily gay men, kept bodies for extended periods, and engaged in necrophilic behavior. Both men were profoundly lonely, struggled with their sexuality in contexts that stigmatized homosexuality, and killed partly to create companions who couldn't leave. Both dismembered victims and disposed of remains through elaborate processes involving chemical dissolution or burning. But there were significant differences. Dahmer's crimes had a stronger sexual component and involved cannibalism, which Dennis never engaged in. Dahmer also attempted to create zombies, living victims whose wills would be destroyed through lobotomy so they would stay with him, reflecting a desire for living companions that Dennis seemed to have abandoned earlier. Dahmer was also younger when caught and had been killing for a shorter period. Like E. Jane, Dennis showed necrophilic tendencies and kept body parts as trophies or functional objects. Both men were profoundly isolated, had disturbed relationships with parental figures, and showed early fascination with death. But Jane's pathology was more directly rooted in maternal enmeshment, and his grave robbing was more extensive than his killing, whereas Dennis's pathology was rooted in general isolation, and his confirmed victim count was higher. Unlike Gary Ridgway or the other high-volume killers in this series, Dennis's victims were not chosen from a single vulnerable population he could hunt systematically. Each victim required individual effort meeting them, convincing them to come home with him, creating the circumstances for killing. This made his killing more labor-intensive and probably contributed to his relatively lower victim count compared to predators who had more efficient hunting methods. Unlike H. Holmes, Dennis did not kill for profit or as part of elaborate fraud schemes. His murders were entirely about personal psychological needs rather than instrumental goals. Holmes was a psychopath who used people and discarded them. Dennis was a lonely man who killed people to keep them. Unlike Albert DeSalvo or Richard Ramirez, Dennis did not show the sexual sadism that characterized those killers' crimes. His violence was instrumental. He killed to obtain corpses, not because the violence itself was gratifying. The torture and brutalization that characterized the Boston Strangler and Night Stalker cases was absent from Dennis's crimes. What distinguishes Dennis most clearly from the other killers in this series is the necrophilic component and the psychological function it served. Most serial killers kill for power, for sexual gratification, for financial gain, or because of compulsive rage. Dennis killed for companionship, and the killing was less important to him than what came after, the weeks or months of keeping the body, maintaining the fiction of presence, resisting the loneliness that would return once the body was finally disposed of. This makes Dennis psychologically unique among serial killers, though not entirely without parallel. Peter Kuhn, the monster of Dusseldorf, showed some similar patterns. So did Edmund Kemper, who kept victims' heads and engaged in prolonged interactions with corpses. But Dennis represents perhaps the purest case of necrophilic companionship in the criminal record, where the keeping of bodies was more central to the pathology than the acquisition of them. Part 11. Unanswered Questions. Despite Dennis's detailed confessions and the forensic examination of his crimes, several significant questions about the case remain unresolved or uncertain. The first is the exact number of victims. Dennis confessed to 15 murders but suggested there might have been more that he couldn't remember clearly or that he was unsure whether to count. The forensic evidence from Melrose Avenue, ash and bone fragments from the garden bonfires, suggested the remains of at least 8 individuals, but precise identification was impossible given the state of the remains. At Cranley Gardens, the remains of 3 victims were identified definitively. This leaves several victims unaccounted for in the physical evidence. Either Dennis's count of 15 was accurate, and some remains were so thoroughly destroyed that they left no detectable trace, or Dennis's count was inflated, and he killed fewer than he claimed, or Dennis's count was conservative, and he killed more than he confessed to. The most likely explanation is that the 15 he confessed to is approximately accurate, with the caveat that some of the details may have been confused or conflated between different victims. Dennis's memory was not perfect, especially for the earlier murders, and he acknowledged that alcohol had impaired his ability to recall specific details. The second question involves the unidentified victims. Of the 15 Dennis confessed to killing, only 8 were ever identified by name. 7 remain unknown, young men who disappeared, and whose families either never reported them missing, or reported them missing but never connected those missing persons' reports to the Nilsen case, or who had no families to report them missing at all. Some of these unidentified victims may have been truly alone in the world, completely disconnected from anyone who cared about them. This is perhaps the saddest aspect of the case, not just that these men were killed, but that their deaths went unnoticed, that their absence from the world created no void that anyone recognized. Efforts to identify these victims have continued sporadically over the decades since Dennis's conviction, using forensic techniques including DNA analysis of the limited remains available. But identification requires having something to compare against, a known DNA sample from a family member, or dental records, or some other reference point. For truly isolated individuals with no surviving family and no previous contact with medical or dental services that created records, identification may be impossible. The third question is whether Dennis killed anyone before Stephen Holmes in December 1978. Dennis claimed that Holmes was his first victim, but some criminologists have questioned whether it's plausible that Dennis's first killing would have been so successful, and that he would have immediately developed the pattern of keeping bodies. It's possible that there were earlier attempts or earlier victims that he didn't include in his confession. However, there's no evidence for any earlier victims beyond speculation. Dennis's account of his psychological state in late 1978, the profound loneliness following Gallatin's departure, the heavy drinking, the impulsive decision to prevent Holmes from leaving, is plausible as the origin story for his killing. First murders are often less organized than subsequent ones, but Dennis's basic approach of strangulation and retention of the body could have developed in that first instance without prior practice. The fourth question involves the two survivors, Paul Nobbs and Carl Stoddard, and whether there were other men who survived encounters with Dennis but never came forward. Dennis strangled both Nobbs and Stoddard to the point of unconsciousness, but released them before they died. In Stoddard's case, Dennis apparently revived him after nearly killing him, a bizarre act of mercy that suggests some internal conflict about the killing. Were there others who escaped or were released? Dennis's confession focused on the men he killed, not on failed attempts or near misses. It's possible that there were other young men who accepted Dennis's invitations, survived the night without being attacked, and never knew how close they came to death. It's also possible that there were other cases like Stoddard where Dennis strangled someone but stopped before killing them, and those men either didn't realize how close they came to dying or didn't report it to police. The fifth question, which will never be answered, is whether Dennis could have stopped. He claimed in some of his writings that the compulsion was irresistible, that he was driven to kill by needs he couldn't control. But he also demonstrated periods where he didn't kill, months between some of the murders, the gap after leaving Melrose Avenue before killing again at Cranley Gardens. These gaps suggest some capacity for control, or at least that the compulsion was intermittent rather than constant. If he had sought psychiatric help, if he had confessed to someone after the first murder or the second, if he had removed himself from the situations that enabled killing, could he have stopped? We can't know. What we know is that he didn't stop until he was caught, and that 15 young men died as a result. Part 12. Final Aria Felicitiones. Dennis Nilsen died in prison on May 12, 2018, at age 72, having spent 34 years incarcerated for murders committed between 1978 and 1983. He killed at least 12 and possibly 15 young men and boys, strangled them while they slept, kept their bodies for weeks or months, and then dismembered and disposed of them through burning or chemical dissolution. He was, by his own analysis and that of the psychiatrist who examined him, profoundly lonely, someone whose inability to form genuine human connections created a void so painful that he filled it with corpses. This explanation is true as far as it goes, but it's insufficient. Many people are profoundly lonely without becoming killers. Dennis's loneliness was compounded by his sexuality in a homophobic society, by childhood trauma involving death, by personality disorders that prevented him from forming the attachments he craved, by his choice to isolate rather than risk the vulnerability that connection requires. The victims deserve to be named and remembered: Stephen Holmes, 14 years old; Kenneth Ockenden, 23; Martin Duffy, 16; Billy Sutherland, 26; Malcolm Barlow, 24; John Howlett, 23; Stephen Sinclair, 20, and the 8 others whose names we don't know but who were people who had lives before they met Dennis, who deserved the years they didn't get to live. Some were children, some were young adults, all were vulnerable in ways that Dennis identified and exploited. He offered them warmth, food, human kindness, and then he killed them for accepting what he offered. The betrayal of trust was fundamental to his crimes. He murdered hospitality itself, turning the act of offering shelter into a death trap. The investigation that caught him was effective but also partly lucky. The blocked drain at Cranley Gardens could easily not have been investigated when it was, and Dennis might have continued killing. The confession that followed his arrest was extraordinarily detailed and helped identify some victims who might otherwise have remained nameless. But it also served Dennis's need to be understood and to position himself as a tragic figure worthy of sympathy. The trial's rejection of his diminished responsibility defense was legally sound. Dennis was mentally ill, but he was not so impaired that he couldn't control his behavior. He held down a job throughout his killing period. He maintained relationships with colleagues. He presented a normal front to the world while conducting his killing and disposal in secret. These facts demonstrated capacity for control and awareness of wrongdoing that made him criminally responsible regardless of his psychological disturbance. His death in prison ended a life that was marked by isolation from beginning to end. Isolated in childhood, isolated as a gay man in a homophobic society, isolated by his choice to kill rather than risk the vulnerability of genuine relationship, isolated finally in a prison cell where he would spend more than 3 decades before dying of natural causes. The case teaches several lessons. It teaches that the most dangerous predators often target the most vulnerable members of society: homeless youth, people with addiction problems, those who have no stable family or social network. It teaches that loneliness is a serious social problem with consequences that extend beyond individual suffering. It teaches that early intervention in cases of profound isolation and psychological disturbance might prevent escalation to violence. It also teaches that understanding killers does not require sympathizing with them. Dennis was a complex human being whose pathology developed through identifiable psychological and social